Okay, so this week instead of doing a gameplay review or a strategic review, I decided I would start working on like a new player guide. There's a lot of veteran players who've thought about making videos on how to help newer players get over the steep learning curve that Napoleonic Total War 3 has. Um, it's probably one of the steepest learning curves of any mod that I've played for sure. Uh, Mostly due to the large amount of units, the complete rework of mechanics and things along those lines. There's like something like 6,000 units or something in the game, multiple factions, and there's a lot to take in and learn, especially in terms of how to actually play the game. Um, so yeah, today's video, I want to try and cover a couple different things, mostly about army building and lobby and things along those lines. Basically, how to get started and into a game itself. Um, for the most part, you won't ever use single player. Don't use single player to try and look at rosters because it won't populate correctly. The money will be weird and things along those lines. The money system has been tweaked for NTW for a reason, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Um, you can host an online lobby if you wanted to. Uh, the difference is it'll show up here in the game, so you can kind of see this guy's probably building an army. um, you'll have to host it post-sorted so that people can't join. I typically tend to actually just do a local network game. That way you don't have to worry about any of that, and you can just build in peace, and people won't be able to see your lobby and things along those lines. So just go through, host a land battle, pick a random map because it doesn't really matter because you're only looking at armies, and then you can just hit host battle. And you'll be greeted by this screen. You, in your own lobby, you'll always join as Alliance 1. Alliance 1 is the coalition forces, and as you'll see here. And then Alliance 2 is the Imperial, as you see here. So Imperial and its allies. So all of the different states that help the French. Um, just a real quick, if you don't see this column here that says Theaters of War when you launch the game, and the Patriotic War or Third Coalition extends all the way to the bottom of your screen, all the way down here, and like maybe Ulsterman Tolstoy is cut off, then your in-game UI is set incorrectly. You'll just have to go to the launcher, and there's like an option that says resolution, and pick through those until you find one that's close to whatever your in-game resolution should be, and it and keep launching and checking until you can see all of the rosters available that I show here. Otherwise, this one will disappear, and like I said, this will be all the way at the bottom. Once you have that fixed, you can kind of see here that it's split into this Theaters of War column over here and custom armies, and then a bunch of different campaigns. This section here is considered the AC section, and then this is obviously the Theaters of War and customs, or TOW factions. The Army Corps groups are all split into their campaigns. So you have the Second Coalition. Each of these corps represents one of the historical corps that took place. This is sort of like the way to put yourselves in the shoes of how to put an army together and the historical rosters that they had available to them. So, for instance, if you look at, I don't know, Bellegarde in 1805, you have Bellegarde as his combat or your overall staff general, and then you have each of his divisions and his free floating artillery from the corps artillery, and a corps pioneer. Uh, and then each of these divisions is broken into a brigade. So you have his grenadier division, another grenadier division, and so on. And then each of the units has the ability to roll different combat gens. They modify the stats based on the stars. Some make them cheaper, some make them more expensive. The more stars generally increases the stats of the unit. So we have this L2 of the Coburg. Regularly, it's 1733. It goes up to 1848 with more morale due to the two stars. It's a little bit more expensive, but you know, the stats make a difference. Another thing is with the Army Corps only, and not the Time of War factions, is that there is a discount involved if you take a brigade, like I mentioned. So this brigade was 3,058 gold with my staff general. If you click your name right here, you can see how much money you actually spent, which was 3,243. So I got a little bit of a discount for taking the full brigade. And then you get an even bigger discount when you take a full division. So I spent 6,389. In reality, I spent 7,238. So I more or less got one unit for free out of the division. The bigger the division, the bigger the discount. The smaller the division, obviously, the smaller the discount. And sometimes it's not actually worth taking a full division. It just depends on the map setting and what your allies need and things along those lines. There are certain armies like Bagration where taking a full division is sometimes detrimental due to the cost of certain units. Like if you don't plan on using the Moskva light infantry, then taking this full division is actually quite painful. Or taking this full division of Cav as a 13-point army is kind of difficult to play around, so on and so forth. But generally speaking, public games tend to not be an AC game. That's not to say that it doesn't happen, but usually it's like organized clan games or experienced players playing internally because of how cores need to mesh together, and uh, it's more of like a team army, whereas Theaters of War allows you to build a balanced army. Some of these cores will be very specific, like Platov is all Cossacks. Uh, you don't have any infantry, you only have Cossacks. And a lot of them are guerrilla, it has a very specific playstyle. You need to know how to work that into your overall arching, you know, team composition and things along those lines. Um, that being said, most pub games, like I said, will be these Theaters of War and custom armies. That's what you'll run into the most, so that's what we'll mostly cover today in this lobby video. Um, in theory, you have all these different numbers next to it. Those are what the point level is of an army. So a 10 pointer is generally speaking like a very high powered army, whereas a 5 pointer is considered a lower powered army. In theory, all of the 10 pointers here and even these 10 pointers here should all have equivalent uh, power and ability. Um, in practice, it doesn't always happen. Balancing and things along those lines make some factions a little bit stronger, uh, or easier at least. 10-point Prussia tends to be quite difficult for new players and even some experienced players due to the low morale, generally like small size and things along those lines. They have excellent shooting, but it's, really difficult to use a 1 morale infantry line. Um, Meanwhile, something like UK Portugal and España is um, generally more new player friendly. They have the really high stat UK lines that are, new player friendly due to their high morale, high shooting. The Portuguese lines give you the mass that you need. You have options for light infantry. You have the option for high stars if you want to take Wellington. Plenty of cavalry options. A lot of it's the Spanish cav, which is cheap and serviceable. It's not going to win cav fights outright, but it it's good enough for what it does, and so on and so forth. You'll learn these sort of nuances as you play factions more. Um, Artillery is different across the board. The biggest thing to know is, you know, when you look at the Theaters of War factions, it'll have each of the cores basically represented as a box. So this is Wellington's core, this is Beresford's core, Tessera, and then Cuesta. I probably butchered at least two of those names, but I apologize for being American. Um, the next part you'll notice is that all the types of units are grouped together. So we have heavy cavalry grouped together, dragoons are grouped together, light cav, lancers by themselves, grenadiers, light infantry. And there's so much light infantry in Cuesta's Corps that it actually wraps around to the bottom. Skirmishers, your line infantry, militia, and then artillery. And then same thing with all these other ones. This is all militia, your line. There's a guerrilla unit here designated by this little red circle at the bottom, light infantry, and so on and so forth. Each of the theaters of war actually has the ability to roll different options. This 10 pointer will always be the same, but your combat gens will change because there's only 4 cores available to roll from. Something like Prussia will have multiple cores to roll from, so your roster will actually change uh, depending on time of day and things along those lines. So you'll have different options to pick from. Same with like a Russia 10, lots of different options. Um, because it's pulling from basically this full roster here, except for I think Platov and Davidov, which are in Ruski Narod. Um, all of these units will roll based on the time of day. Sometimes you'll get, Tuchkov. Sometimes you'll get Konstantin or Wittgenstein or Tormasov. You'll get Bagration a few times. Um, but yeah, that's the general idea. These will change, uh, and more or less you can play the faction still the same, but maybe your favorite unit won't be there. Maybe you really like having, the Pavlov Grenadiers, but you won't get to play with them every single time. But it's a benefit. You can kind of pick and choose new units, expand your playstyle, learn new parts of the roster. At least that's the idea behind it. Custom armies will always have the same roster. That's why they're a custom army. They're meant to represent like a larger faction that hasn't got all of the cores done yet. So the HRE faction is basically the first coalition armies. This Prussia 1813-14 is exactly what it sounds like. It's the Prussian army approximately of 1813 and 14. As the lords keep adding more AC, these custom armies will probably go away and be replaced by new theaters of war. That's slowly in progress. Like we got the fifth coalition recently, second coalition, and this subjugation war. Before we had all these other ones, and then we introduced the theaters of war recently. And by we, I mean the lords. I'm not actually a lord, but I was just speaking plurally there. Um, yeah, so that's generally like a quick and dirty idea of how the points and factions work. Take some time to just look through some of them if you have it. For today's video, I was planning on building um, on the Imperial side, uh, mostly because Imperial is a little bit easier to play, or at least more new player friendly due to their high stats and morale and things along those lines. Um, One other thing to mention, I guess, before I move on to that, is that you should not mix any AC within itself. So don't take two parts of Prussia 1806 and two factions of Espana 1811. Um, while they are balanced in theory, like numerically, so like this 9 should be equal to Ajiro 9, uh, they're balanced within their core. So all of the cores are balanced together to give their points. So taking Ajiro out and putting him in Espana 1811 doesn't actually equate the same. Same with like taking Davout out of 1812 and putting him into the 1805 coalition. Um, it just doesn't work quite right in terms of pricing and how things work out. Um, Similarly, you shouldn't mix these AC here with theaters of war and army completes, or the custom armies rather, um, for the same reasons. The pricing for these, like I showed earlier, gets price discounts and other things for division, brigade, etc. That don't happen for theaters of war, um, because they represent, the entire theater. You can bring more balanced armies and things along those lines. So keep that in mind. Try not to, if you're hosting a public lobby, you basically are following Lord's rules. So mixing AC and Theater's War and mixing AC within themselves is generally not allowed. Likewise, Civil War. So you have a Russia faction here, and you could have a Russia faction over here. This is not allowed because of um, it'll sometimes glitch the units, but also the flags become confusing and things along those lines. The factions aren't actually balanced to fight each other, uh, especially with like something like this where this faction actually has the option to roll um, guerrillas if you have the right role. Yeah, so you have guerrilla options. This unit behind coalition lines will look just like the coalition unit. So it'll have the same flag and everything, and you won't actually know that he's behind you about to like kill your general or something. Um, so yeah, civil war is also not allowed. So more or less for today's video, I was just going to use a low point faction because if you're a new player watching this, it's generally kind of recommended that you don't take a high points. That's because if you take, say, France 11, and you're in a 36 point total game, you're now 11 points out of 36. You have a lot of responsibility to perform at a high level and help carry your team with 11 points. Um, Whereas if you take 6 point Russia North here, you're only 6 points out of 36 now. You've left 30 points for your allies to pick up, and let your more experienced players, I guess you could say, you know, do some of the heavy lifting while you're still kind of learning the mechanics and balance and things along those lines in the game. I'm gonna use this 1811 8 pointer because it's probably one of the more balanced armies in general in terms of what you have options to. Um, you'll see what I mean by that in a little bit. So I have these three cores. I'm building this blind because I didn't want to pre-build an army, uh, especially since everything will change, and I wasn't sure if it would change midway through the video. Um, so I'm one of the people that likes to bring high stars. That's personal preference. So I'm probably going to take Suchet, especially since he's only 680 gold. It would be different if it's, migration for 6 stars and 1600 gold. Um, you can take a cheaper general. Like, Coalition tends to pay more for stars across the board. You have, for example, back here, Wellington being 2000 gold. People don't tend to take them. I still do sometimes for fun builds. That each star represents one morale that he can provide to your troops. So if you have like a 2 morale unit, he adds, what is it, 8 stars, so 8 morale to that. So instead of 2 morale, it's now 10 morale, and the 9 morale unit, is off the charts. Um, if you've never seen how long a nine, like a high star general backing troops will fight to, like you can make 0 morale troops fight to half strength, which is uh, very useful at times, assuming you can keep them alive. So yeah, moving on, I would probably pick my cavalry next. That's generally what I try to do. I look for stats like stamina and shock res and try to find, at least with dragoons, if I'm trying to go for mass and numbers of dragoons, I look for the total unit count, which is over there, the manpower 75. Um, and then the next thing I look for is like their melee attack. So this one has 14, which is about average. It's not crazy. This one is above average, being 17 and 90 men with chakras and stamina. But, it's 1400 gold. So if you're not good with Cav, I recommend not taking too much Cav because you're just going to lose it. And then you're going to be down all of that gold that you dunked into Cav. So for this build, I'm just going to take these three because they're fairly affordable. I have one good Cav to work off of, and then the rest will be Pursuit. Um, from there, I try to pick a light Cav for scouting. You can take two if you want. I've become efficient enough with my Cav play that I can usually get away with just one, even in public lobbies. You want something that can, scout well enough and survive if it gets caught. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of those types of options, so I'm just going to pay for something that I can scout with. In that case, probably something like this. It's 41 men. 5 morale is not great, but uh, I'm going to be using it for scouting anyways. Just so you know, like light cav, as I've mentioned before, has the furthest scouting range. Lancers, while you could take them as a scout, they will be outclassed by someone's light cav, and then you shouldn't use dragoons for scouting at all. Um, Next, I usually take my artillery. Things like F2 guns in pub games, unless you're spawning at the front of a map, like there are maps with forward deployments, F2 guns really won't make it there, With speed, everything is ranked from 1 to 6. Um, well, except for Cav, which has C7 and C8 and C9. But uh, guns are ranked from F1 through F6, F6 being the fastest and F1 being the slowest. F1 and F2 guns rarely will make it to the front line if you're trying to drag them all the way there. Usually, like, one army will be routed by the time that these guns show up. So even though they're cheap and they're decent stats, having 63 accuracy and 48 reload with two guns for only 300 gold, it ends up being a waste because they won't ever make it to the field. Um, I'm probably going to take these F5 guns here because they're cheap. They're not amazing stats. Like, it's 43 accuracy, I think. Yeah, and 39 reload, which isn't great. It's not terrible, but they're fast and they're cheap. Um, for more damage dealing, I'll probably take these 8-pounders. If you want more close range support, you could take these 4-pounders to break up positions. The way I use artillery is for zoning and long range damage to try and keep either the enemy at bay or shaping the battlefield and things along those lines. That's personal preference. How you use guns is up to you. Next, I typically will take my skirmishers and light infantry. Skirmishers will be a little bit difficult for new players to get used to. Uh, they're really important, in my opinion, in terms of, like, I guess you can say competitive play, especially for Imperial, because you get so many skirmishers. And historically, the skirmisher formations and things like that, and the order mixed, and uh, how Napoleon actually deployed his armies, the skirmishers were probably one of the best additions to the tactical flexibility of Imperial formations. And you can honestly replicate that in the game by using skirmishers to good effect. I'm just going to bring these four. These ones are chunky. These ones are just cheap S1s. Typically, I don't like S1 skirmishers. That's personal preference. Next, I'm going to bring my light infantry. I try to pair skirmishers with light infantry to kind of, make sure that they're supported. You can use skirmishers to support your cav, and then light infantry to support your skirmishers. So I'm going to take these ones because I don't have that many affordable light infantry options. Um, I wanted at least L5 to be able to keep pace with my scrims and at least be able to pay for some stats that actually do something. So these ones are 2568. It's not amazing stats for light infantry, but they at least have stamina, and they're kind of big with 94 men. Um, from there, I try to take my damage dealing. In this case, I probably am going to go with Grenadiers because it's an Imperial faction. I have fairly well-priced Grenadiers. G2 is kind of slow, but that unit's really well-priced and it's statted really nicely. I'll probably take these G3 instead. No, I'll do the G2s. Um, G2 will take a lot longer to get into the charge, but its stats are nice enough that if you can actually get it to make contact, then it'll really start punishing. I'll use the G4 to kind of get into melee, G2 to back it up. And then from there, we start building up our line. I'm going to start trying to find what I want to build around in terms of my main line. So I'll take two of these as my pinning army, or pinning unit. They're slow, they have okay stats, but they're kind of big at 100 men, for this faction at least. So they'll be able to soak up damage, and they're cost effective at 165 gold. From there, we can start looking for other units. These L3s are nice. These L4s are okay. We'll want something to stab with, so these ones have 14 melee. You can take, two of those. And they're decently priced for their speed of L4. We can take a combat gen. This unit's big and L5, so it's kind of interesting. And then we'll just try and round out whatever we have left in terms of gold. Let me see if I can organize this a little bit better. we can actually upgrade that unit. Or maybe I just picked the same one. Anyways, it doesn't really matter. Like I said, this won't be like a build that I would necessarily say you should take or recommend, or even if it's a good build or not. I'm sure among one of the things that people are most opinionated in this game is builds. Everyone has their own play styles. Everyone considers themselves god of making armies. Um, Depending on how min-maxy you are, will depend on how much you can squeeze into an army. I really don't care that much. I just try to look for things that I can use, and if they're at an okay price for what I want them to do. Obviously, like I'm not gonna take like Austria 10 and try to build an L5 army out of it. It's just not reasonably like priced, like 1,000 gold for L5. Um, and you don't even get that many L5s, you know. So trying to build a fast Austria army is like not what you're trying to do. Likewise, you know, here you're trying to balance out what your damage dealers are and things along those lines. Um, Now, for me, with this type of setup, I try to always group units based on their speed and their role, as you could see when I was building. So I have all my cav here, my guns, my skirmishers, my light infantry paired together. So they'll always work in a pair, which makes it easier in the long run for micro. So instead of thinking of 30 units or something along those lines, you can kind of group them in your head mentally as a quote unquote brigade. Um, when you see people mention brigade tactics or something along those lines, or brigading your army, that's what they mean. Grouping, the group function that Total War has, doesn't work for this mod because of the different speed classes. And if you group units together, they'll actually try to run in game. You don't want to run your units, and we'll get into that later, but mostly because they become visible and they'll get tired out and things along those lines. So you can't actually group your units. Um, so try to mentally group them like I have them here. So I have my light infantry brigade, my grenadier reserve brigade. I have a pinning brigade of these two units here, a flanking L4 brigade that can be supported by these two L4s that are meant for stabbing or melee. An L5 by itself, it can be supported by these two irregular L5s, and then this lasts a little bit of L3s that have a variety of stats available to them. Honestly, I could probably get all of these instead of these two, but again, that's more like min-maxy. Um, yeah, like in general, you can just kind of think of it that way because this way you can shift select these three units together, and instead of having three units to control, you only have one now. And same with this, like instead of two units here, it's one unit. Um, it becomes really important to be able to do this whenever you get into more like competitive play, or if you just want to be able to like control your armies a little bit better instead of dragging out one long line, which we'll also get into uh, when I do a video tutorial on like deployment and things along those lines. So yeah, that's more or less like army composition. There's a lot more nuance to it, and it'll take a lot of time. You'll need to look through rosters, but each of your units should really have a purpose, and those purposes should support other units. So I can have my skirmishers and light infantry buy me ground. They support the cavalry, which also buys me ground. I can bring up my guns to take over that space, and that opens up more avenues for my infantry to come up. I can use my quicker L4s to replace my L5s, which then get replaced by the L2s to just kind of stand there and wither away at the enemy. I have more L5s for speed to make flanking maneuvers and push the enemy out of position. Uh, each of these units is, you know, mentally designed for a specific role. Like I said before, you know, these two I want to get into melee with. These ones are more for maneuver and shooting. Um, but yeah, just when you're building armies, try to have an idea of what you want the function of those groups to be, and then go from there. Um, yeah, like I said, I hope to be able to make this into a full series of at least like introductory videos and like really high level um, tips and tricks. If you have any, you know, specific questions, you can leave a comment and I'll try to get back to you on it. Like I said, I'm not like the super min-maxy player. I enjoy, you know, having a balanced army and having a thought of like some idea of what I want to put together, but I don't sit there and like look at each stat and be like, okay, well, this one costs 250 gold, but it has 20 and 50. I can spend 30 gold less and get, you know, 10 more men, but it shoots at 18 accuracy. Those types of stats is not really actually as important as people put into the game, and more of like overall idea of how your army is composed is, in my opinion, more important. But yeah, anyways, I'll go ahead and end this video for now, and hope it's helpful to at least one person out there. Um, and thanks again.